nothing very crucial. I'll send that out in an announcement.
You just put it in, but like you don't like. I was like, how does that dilute it? You're just adding the same mixture to the. I don't know.
It dilutes it, Grace, because you're adding.
So, just funny interjections. Grace was talking to somebody as she signed it, as she was waiting for me to come in. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about the exam, about the quiz, and any other questions at all before sort of launch into what's going on today? Go back here, make sure. Okay, and one other thing here is I'll use this PowerPoint. Okay, so just to remind everybody, we're left. Gardner leaves us in this place where we're kind of by ourselves in the open world, and Arendt offers an account of a sheltered private life that, if it's rich enough and valuable enough, becomes a source of kind of like resilience for us. I think that's the biggest thing. That's sort of where we left. So the question is, how does this work out, and how do we take this sort of forward? And that's why I've picked the political to be the third of these elements. So as you can see on the slide here, and then I'm just going to share the slide so that people can see it on the computer screen better than on video. As you can see from the slide that's on the screen, what happens is that we understand if we're just raw individuals going on in the world, and if we're just raw students, if you're just doing everything without relying on other people while you're doing student work, you're going to get overwhelmed. And that's a really big, important issue for you as how it would apply to you directly. Now, Arendt offers us that and I'm offering, together with Taylor and Arendt, offering this idea that if we have a rich private life filled with significant others who care for us, who want us to do better, that's actually a better foundation for surviving and for doing well, for succeeding in life, whatever we call success. Then the kind of articulation that Gardner gives, and the kind of articulation I think we live in, that is, I think, the public world or the political world that you'll find in Canada to be particularly advocating that you have to be able to do everything as an individual, as a raw individual, using your capability and your skills. A lot of the foundations of university life is built on that premise. In fact, a lot of the reasons you're sold to come to university are that way. When Arendt talks about, so the university is just one example of this, but when Arendt talks about the political, she has a particularly important imagination. So when she outlines political in the book, she actually goes through a bit of a history, just like she did with the private. But in the political realm, she kind of goes through three realms. She goes back to ancient Greece, as she's prone to do. She talks about the Judeo-Christian background, that she's Jewish. And then she talks about the Enlightenment version, of course, because she's an academic. And she talks about the realm of public knowledge. And the realm of public knowledge is that for you to be considered to be an individual who's got an impact in the political world, you have to belong to a kind of realm of public knowledge, right? So it'd be foolish, like you would look foolish if somebody asked you, hey, do you guys know that Russia invaded Ukraine? What if you didn't know that? How would you feel? What if you didn't know that that was a world event? How would you feel? You might say stupid.
Yeah.
Right? Some people feel, I feel stupid, right? Or how would I look if, for example, I assumed that all three of you were from the same country? You are? You are from the same country? But so then I would accidentally get that right. Or if I said that everybody from Africa is from the same place. That would be foolish, right? Right? That would be really, really foolish. And I would look stupid, right? So to be impactful, you have to have a certain kind of understanding of a certain amount of knowledge. That's what universities end up being, right? You have to have a certain kind of amount of knowledge. You have to awareness of particular things. You have to, like when Kyrie Irving, the basketball player, tried to advocate that the world was flat, that the earth was flat, about 2 years ago, he looked pretty dumb. He said it on an American talk show in front of millions of people. He looked pretty dumb and he got criticized for it, and he got kind of like, you idiot, just dribble the basketball and you just don't talk about world events, like that kind of thing. Except he's a public figure, supposed to have a certain amount of public knowledge. Well, the model for that kind of idea of what it meant to be intelligent or what it means to be impactful in the world altogether is the philosopher in the Enlightenment. And the idea of the philosopher is the person who sits up in there, and so there's a model like this that has a kind of ironic difference, but it's the same model. That is, you're a public intellectual and you have a certain kind of knowledge, and you're supposed to know things and be able to say interesting things about everything in the world, but you really are just sort of isolated. So ironically, the philosopher just sort of seems like the isolated thinker in the ivory tower, who doesn't think amongst other people, but is sort of just involved in their own thoughts. That's the model of, in a certain sense, a kind of model of intelligence. But ironically, there's another person who sort of exists these days. It's the person who sits behind their computer and comments on all sort of social media posts. The sort of keyboard warrior. You know what I mean by the keyboard warrior? The keyboard warrior is a guy who sits there on all social media sites. A guy or a girl, doesn't have to be a guy, but sits on all social media sites and types in on all sorts of comments. Oftentimes they're negative or cynical or conspiracy theory type people. And they sit there and do that, but they never get out of their basement. They're living in their parents' house and doing this. And that's the kind of life they lead. They're isolated too and having these types of thoughts. Well, there's a lot of similarities with the philosopher in the ivory tower of the university. But that was what the Enlightenment model of what it meant to be a sort of like intelligent person acting freely in the world. The philosopher was supposed to be that. And the keyboard warrior, strangely, is that as well. Unacknowledged, of course, is the fact that the keyboard warrior's parents is paying for their residence. The philosopher's university is paying for their right to do that kind of thing. And we get this in the model of the YouTuber. The YouTuber, there are a few successful YouTubers, and there are millions and millions of unsuccessful YouTubers. People trying to make their living on YouTube, working out of their basement and barely interacting with anybody, just interacting with what the media informs them with. They have no access to anything except some form of media. So this is the realm of the public This is an outgrowth of the realm of public knowledge. That is, to be a free human being is to be this kind of person, modeled. For 200 years, it was the philosopher, but now we're starting to see YouTubers being modeled as this is what it means to be a free type of person. If you ask any kid now, one of their specific career aspirations is to be a YouTuber. You ask any kid now, YouTubing is the kind of thing that's going to be the thing, right? But it's going to be, that's the way I'm going to make my money, right? My kids said it for some time, until I beat the living hell out of them. I'm just kidding, I didn't actually, but I said, no, you got to get out into the world. Okay, you can't, you're not gonna do this on YouTube because you'd have to be extraordinarily lucky to be successful. You could be brilliant, but you also have to be lucky in order to be successful. Right? YouTube as a media device is like Times Square in New York. It's just filled with noise. YouTube is just filled with noise. And it's very hard to make yourself stand out in the midst of that. And we get back to the old sort of way that the polis had moved out of the people standing in the streets, yelling their opinions. People would stand on street corners, arguing, yelling out loud. This is what happened in Greece and in Rome. But we had to move away from that. It had to be sort of contained, right? Western democracies had something like the public sphere where all the realm of public knowledge was held in the newspaper. But even now, the newspapers don't hold public knowledge. They're oftentimes giving misinformation. Not just the newspapers, but regular media are giving misinformation. There isn't a realm, a sustainable realm of public knowledge that sort of exists. So what are we left with? Well, Arendt sort of has this sort of answer that's really deep. And so I want to show you what her criticism is and then her answer. And then we're going to look at a video to demonstrate how right she is. When Arendt discusses the political world, Arendt discusses the difference between one's life as an individual and one's life as a citizen. Okay? And it's between the life spent in on one's own and the life spent in common with others. She argues that our public interest as citizens is quite distinct from our private interest as individuals. Okay, pause here for a second here. Use King's as an example. Each of us comes from a different place within the King's University. I'm a professor, each of you are students, but in different majors. But you have different majors or different combinations of majors of what you're studying. And some people are new here, some people have been at King's for a little while. And there's all kinds of diversity, but King's is the common denominator in this situation. Okay, so our interest as members of the King's community have to be different than just our private interests. I was listening to a student come talk the other morning, and she was mentioning about the number of King students who were leaving because they had to take so many, they had to take like an English course even though they were a computer science major. Why do I have to take an English course? Like that kind of thing, like there were requisites that they didn't privately want. And the King's was demanding that they fulfill certain sort of requirement. That's because King's has to do more than just the private interest of each individual student. Not like each individual student is like a client. They're not client, they're not only clients, right? The institution has to be more than this. It's more than just being even the highest common denominator. And it's not, and the university can't just pick Divine's interest and Andre's interest and Matthew's interest and Toby's interest and Gavin's and Grace's interest. It doesn't just pick these interests up and then put them together and form a university. It doesn't work that way, right? You can't just add all of these interests together and then we just create a university out of that. It doesn't work that way. It can't. Because the institution is here before you arrive in it, before I arrive in it, and it will be here after we leave it. So even if you guys are gone in 2-3 years, or 4 years, or however long your program is, or I'm gone in 10 to 15 years when you know I'm about 15 years from retirement, that kind of thing. And if I'm gone in 15 years, if I end up working at King's that long, Although I think I told the line I was going to go retire on the beach, but anyway. So if I'm here that long, Kings will still be here. From the time I enter to the time I leave, Kings acts as a kind of place that there's a kind of common interest that's bigger than my interest plus your interests, right? So being in common means that we don't just have common interests, we have shared interests. Like, it's not that it's common, but think of an educational experience between a teacher and a student. In an environment like this, the educational experience between a teacher and a student is like this. I need you and you need me. For the best educational experience, there's going to be a direct relationship. You don't just need the stuff of the course, right? It's actually more than that that's going on. And it doesn't work. If any one of us steps out of that relationship, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. The educational experience will not happen if the student is either not engaged or the teacher is not building the relationship with the student. And if you think that you're learning the most when you come to university, you're wrong. It's always your professors are learning way more. In fact, the political world, I just use Kings as an example. University is actually much more of a social entity, but in fact, the political world has little to do with our private interests, since it concerns the world that lies beyond ourselves, that was there before our birth and will be there after our death, a world that finds embodiment in activities and institutions that have their own purposes. You'll find out that Kings has a mission, has its own purposes that we're all a part of, right? And those purposes may be at odds with our private interests, right? And our private interests oftentimes can be very short-term as well, right? The public interest, therefore, refers therefore to the interests of the public world which we share as citizens. And which we can pursue and enjoy only by going beyond our private self-interest. This is the main argument against Gardner's individualism type of individualism, what I call bootstrap individualism or subjectivism. Right there, I just want to answer the question. Right? Said it again. But that's the argument. We have shared interests. We don't just have our own private interests. And it shows you the danger of what comes from being isolated if we only think of everything in terms of our own private self-interest. Right? And this is important. Now, I'm gonna shift a bit here now, and I'm gonna stop the share of this because I know the video on my slide doesn't work. And I'm gonna ding, 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 ding. Where's my Google? There we go. And so now what we're going to do is take a look at see how this sort of works forward. And I want to play a video for you called The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Okay, and I'll just sort of demonstrate to you a little bit about how our private interests will actually, if we just focus primarily on our private interests, it will primarily, if that's all we focus on, it will primarily damage the world. That is, we'll be doing damage to the world as we are only concerned solely about our private interests. So we're going to look at a video. It's a video by an economics professor from, he taught sometime at Yale University, but he's done some really interesting research on organizational behavior and motivation. When you get a job, what are the reasons you get a job? Money. Yep. From your perspective, it's frequently about money because mostly at where you guys are in life, money is in short supply. Feels like it's in short supply, right? What, are there other reasons you take a job? I once took a job at 7-Eleven. And I worked there for 4 years, and the biggest reason I took the job was so I could be close to the Slurpee machine. I got the money, but I loved the perk of that. I was addicted to Slurpees, so I loved the perk of being able to go get Slurpees anytime I wanted to when I was at work. Sounds dumb, right? But yeah, I was getting the money. My private interest was there, but this was the kind of like little perk. I was going to feed my Slurpee addiction. I ended up working there for 4 years. Not just like as a cashier, I ended up becoming like a loss prevention officer, but still, the biggest thing while I was making sure, I was trying to figure out who stole cigarettes, the biggest thing I got was still being able to drink Slurpees while I was doing it. Like I'd been counting cigarettes with a Slurpee in my hand. That was a constant image of me for 4 straight years. Because as a loss prevention officer, the biggest thing that 7-Eleven loses is cigarettes. And 95% of them are going from the staff, not because of staff error, but the staff are stealing. Interesting to know that. But anyway, what are other reasons you take a job? Money? Yeah. Work experience? Something you want to do, maybe? Something that you go, oh, that'd be fun. I wouldn't mind spending 4 hours a day, 3 or 4 days a week doing that activity. Okay, I can go do that work. Right? Might be something like that. Like I'll find enjoyment. But all of those are sort of private interests. So when we watch this video, he's going to talk about private interests, what he'll call carrots and sticks. These are incentives for us to go do the job. But then he's going to dig down deeper. And he's going to find out something that actually drives us more than those particular private interests. At the end, at the end of the video, I want you guys to tell me he's going to have 3 types of motivations that come out that are not just private interests, but are much more, have to do with our character as human beings. I want to find out what those are.
Our motivations are unbelievably interesting. I mean, I've been working on this for a few years, and I just find the topic still so amazingly engaging and interesting. So I want to tell you about that. The science is really surprising. The science is a little bit freaky, okay? We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think. There's a whole set of unbelievably interesting studies. I want to give you 2 that call into question this idea that if you reward something, you get more of the behavior you want. If you punish something, you get less of it. So let's go from London to the mean streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the northeastern part of the United States. And let's talk about a study done at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Here's what they did. They took a whole group of students, and they gave them a set of challenges. Things like memorizing strings of digits, solving word puzzles, other kinds of spatial puzzles, even physical tasks like throwing a ball through a hoop. Okay, they gave them these challenges, and they said to incentivize their performance, they gave them 3 levels of rewards. Okay, so if you did pretty well, you got a small monetary reward. If you did medium well, you got a medium monetary reward. And if you did really well, if you were one of the top performers, you got a large cash prize.
And you'll notice by the quiz, they did something that kind of went across a range of multiple intelligences, right? So they understood the multiple intelligence theory already when they were doing this research.
Okay? We've seen this movie before. This is essentially a typical motivation scheme within organizations, right? We reward the very top performers, we ignore the low performers, and the other folks kind of in the middle. Okay, you get a little bit. So what happens? They do the test, they have these incentives. Here's what they found out. 1, as long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better their performance. Okay, that makes sense. But here's what happens. But once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, a larger reward led to poorer performance.
So just think of the irony of this. The one right away said money for a job. Imagine you got, but you're in university and you're learning to do stuff that's highly cognitively very difficult. So when you go out, can you still seek jobs just for money? Because the higher the reward, if that is money going to be the constant motivator? Because the higher the reward, you'll actually do worse on cognitive stuff. That's the theory. Right? So there's a kind of irony or problem in that situation.
Now, this is strange, right? A larger reward led to poorer performance. How can that possibly be? Now, what's interesting about this is that these folks here who did this are all economists, two at MIT, one at the University of Chicago, one at Carnegie Mellon, okay, the top tier of the economics profession. And they're reaching this conclusion that seems contrary to what a lot of us learned in economics, which is that the higher the reward, the better their performance. And they're saying that once you get above rudimentary cognitive skill, it's the other way around. Which seems like this kind of, the idea that these rewards don't work that way seems vaguely left-wing and socialist, doesn't it? It's kind of this kind of weird socialist conspiracy. For those of you who have those conspiracy theories, I want to point out the notoriously left-wing socialist group that financed the research, the Federal Reserve Bank. So this is the mainstream of the mainstream coming to a conclusion that's quite surprising, seems to defy the laws of behavioral physics. So this is strange, a strange finding. So what do? They say, this is freaky. Let's go test it somewhere else. Maybe that $50 or $60 prize isn't sufficiently motivating for an MIT student, right? So let's go to a place where $50 is actually more significant relatively, right? So let's take the experiment. We're going to go to Madurai, India, rural India, where $50, $60, whatever the number was, is actually a significant sum of money. So they replicated the experiment in India roughly as follows. Small rewards, the equivalent of 2 weeks' salary. Small performance, low performance, 2 weeks' salary. Medium performance, about a month's salary. High performance, about 2 months' salary. Okay, so those are real good incentives. Okay, so you're going to get a different result here. Well, what happened, though, was that the people offered the medium reward did no better than the people offered the small reward. But this time around, the people offered the top reward. They did worst of all. Higher incentives led to worse performance. What's interesting about this is that it actually isn't all that anomalous. This has been replicated over and over and over again by psychologists, by some extent by sociologists, and by economists, over and over and over again. For simple, straightforward tasks, those kinds of incentives, if you do this, then you get that, they're great. For tasks that are algorithmic, set of rules where you have to just follow along and get a right answer, if-then rewards, carrots and sticks, outstanding. But when the task gets more complicated, when it requires some conceptual creative thinking, those kinds of motivators demonstrably don't work. In fact, money is a motivator at work, but in a slightly strange way. If you don't pay people enough, they won't be motivated. What's curious about, there's another paradox here, which is that the best use of money as a motivator is to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table.
Pause it there for a minute, just give you a good example of this in real life. So all of your King's University professors make approximately 10 to 15% lower than their colleagues at McEwen University or University of Alberta. Okay, so we all make lower money than the equivalent, someone doing the equivalent job in another university. Now, there's a reason why it still works. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute, but it has something to do with this. So for example, I got offered a position to be an interdisciplinary studies director at Baylor University in Austin, Texas. At Christmas time this last year, I got the job offer. I never even applied for it. They asked me to come and work there. And the job was 43% higher salary than it was here, taking into account all factors of what the salary was. But the idea of moving my family to the United States, to Texas yet, they would have had to offer me 4 to 5 times as much money as what they were offering me in order for me to make that move. I just did not want to live in Texas. My family did not want to live in Texas. I have an LGBTQ kid. Why am I going to put that person in Texas? Why would I bring my child to Texas to face the kind of prejudice that would be inevitable, right? So why do we do the jobs at King's? for less money than our counterparts. Because at minimum, they pay us enough so we don't have to think about money. That is, we're not consciously thinking about how much money we have at the end of the month. We have enough to raise a family and do the things that are, it's sufficient, right? It's not huge, it's just enough, right? But it's enough, we're not thinking about money. That's why we can still continue to do the work, right? I mean, Austin, Texas, definitely the weather would be better. But you know what? Why would I stay in Edmonton and freeze my ass off every year? Lots of good reasons. But the important point is that money only works to a certain point. At a certain point in your life, you're not going to care about money. And all of you, because your dad kings, have paid more money to go to school than you would have if you'd gone to another institution. Which means at some point in your life, you probably won't suffer either. Right now, you're poor. But you have enough money to actually take care of yourself because you come from money. That there's some money that's come into putting you here, right? Which says that you come from a kind of socioeconomic status that says you're going to be okay in the long run, right? There's that kind of security is there. And it's not even talking about God. This is just talking about what's there for you already. You'll eventually be okay, right? So once we have the understanding that we're going to be okay, it has to be different understandings or different motivations that drive us to work. Once we know that financially we're going to be okay, we're not going to be choosing jobs for money. We might need to for periods of time, but it can't be the overall thing, right? And since you're learning cognitively difficult stuff at university, not everybody goes to university, right? Since you're learning cognitively difficult stuff, you're also going to have to find a motivation outside of what money can be, right? And that's important to understand that.
Pay people enough so that they're not thinking about money and they're thinking about the work. Now, once you do that, it turns out there are 3 factors that the science shows lead to better performance, not to mention personal satisfaction. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is our desire to be self-directed, to direct our own lives. Now, in many ways, traditional notions of management run afoul of that.
And I'll just mention, I've been using the term authenticity a little bit like autonomy. That is, we're true to ourselves, right? We're not so pushed by other people.
Management is great if you want compliance, but if you want engagement, which is what we want in the workforce today as people are doing more complicated, sophisticated things, self-direction is better. Let me give you some examples of this, of almost radical forms of self-direction in the workplace that lead to good results. Let's start with this company right here, Atlassian, an Australian company. It's a software company, and they do something really cool. Once a quarter on a Thursday afternoon, they say to their developers, for the next 24 hours, you can work on anything you want. You can work on it the way you want. You can work on it with whomever you want. All we ask is that you show the results to the company at the end of those 24 hours in this fun kind of meeting, not a star chamber session, but this fun meeting with beer and cake and fun and other things like that. It turns out that that one day of pure, undiluted autonomy has led to a whole array of fixes for existing software, a whole array of ideas for new products that otherwise had never emerged. One day. Now, this is not an if-then incentive. This is not the sort of thing that I would have done 3 years ago before I knew this research. I would have said, you want people to be creative and innovative? Give them a freaking innovation bonus. If you do something cool, I'll give you $2,500. They're not doing this at all. They're essentially saying, you probably want to do something interesting. Let me just get out of your way. One day of autonomy produces things that had never emerged. Okay, let's talk about mastery. Mastery is our urge to get better at stuff. We like to get better at stuff. This is why people play musical instruments on the weekend. You got all these people who are acting in ways that seem irrational economically. They play musical instruments on weekends. Why? It's not going to get them a mate. It's not going to make them any money. Why are they doing it? Because it's fun, because you get better at it, and that's satisfying. Go back in time a little bit. I imagine this if I went to my first economics professor, a woman named Mary Alice Schulman, and I went to her in 1983 and said, Professor Schulman, can I talk to you after class for a moment? Yeah. I got this inkling. I got this idea for a business model. I just want to run it past you. Here's how it would work. You get a bunch of people around the world who are doing highly skilled work, but they're willing to do it for free and volunteer their time, 20, sometimes 30 hours a week. Okay, she's looking at you somewhat skeptically there. Oh, but I'm not done. And then what they create, they give it away rather than sell it. It's going to be huge. I mean, she truly would have thought I was insane. Okay, it seemed to fly in the face of so many things. But what do you have? You have Linux powering 1 out of 4 corporate servers in Fortune 500 companies, Apache powering more than the majority of web servers, Wikipedia. What's going on? Why are people doing this? Why are these people, many of whom are technically sophisticated, highly skilled people who have jobs? Okay, they have jobs. They're working at jobs for pay, doing sophisticated technological work, and yet during their limited discretionary time, they do equally, if not more, technically sophisticated work, not for their employer, but for someone else for free. That's a strange economic behavior. Economists who look into it, why are they doing this? It's overwhelmingly clear. Challenge and mastery, along with making a contribution. That's it. What you see more and more is a rise of what you might call the purpose motive, is that more and more organizations want to have some kind of transcendent purpose. Partly because it makes coming to work better, partly because that's the way to get better talent. And what we're seeing now is, in some ways, when the profit motive becomes unmoored from the purpose motive, bad things happen. Bad things ethically sometimes, but also bad things just like not good stuff, like crappy products, like lame services, like uninspiring places to work. That when the profit motive is paramount, or when it becomes completely unhitched from the purpose motive, it's just, people don't do great things. More and more organizations are realizing this and sort of disturbing the categories between what's profit and what's purpose. And I think that actually heralds something interesting. And I think that organizations that are flourishing, whether they're profit, for profit, or somewhere in between, are animated by this purpose motive. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's the founder of Skype. He says, our goal is to be disruptive, but in the cause of making the world a better place. Pretty good purpose.
So, I'll just mention about Skype. You guys are young enough that probably Skype is not revolutionary in your mind, but it was a huge revolution in my life. That is, it was impossible for me to consider the idea of living apart from my children and my wife and work in another country without Skype. I could not have imagined being there for 2 years and not having daily contact with my kids, which is what Skype allowed. It was revolutionary. I couldn't have afforded the phone bills. Phone bills would have been insane had I been trying to do that. I mean, I made a few calls, but usually we just met on Skype. Right? I mean, it was disruptive, right? It just disrupted the whole phone communication. Right? Without Skype, you wouldn't have mobile phones. It was around before Apple.
Here's Steve Jobs. I want to put a ding in the universe. All right? That's the kind of thing that might get you up in the morning and racing to go to work. So I think that, that we are purpose maximizers, not only profit maximizers. I think the science shows that we care about mastery very, very deeply. And the science shows that we want to be self-directed. And I think that the big takeaway here is that if we start treating people like people and not assuming that they're simply horses, slower, smaller, better smelling horses, if we get past this kind of ideology of carrots and sticks and look at the science, I think we can actually build organizations and work lives that make us better off, but I also think they have the promise to make our world just a little bit better.
Pause there. So I just want to bring this back. Now I have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to say a couple of things since this is the last content lecture, but I just want to tie something together. Remember how I started the whole course? I started it with the purposes of global education. And you start seeing them tie together here now in this video of something that these things are all part of education, but these things are all part of individual motivation, deep individual drives that we have. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose, these three things. Autonomy is the ability to be self-directed. Mastery is the desire to get better at stuff. And purpose is that desire to impact the world, right? What we're going to do is actually going to change the world, right? So these three motivations are actually deeply tied to your identity as an individual. That's the argument I've been trying to make and that I've been bringing forth Arendt to do. And the interesting thing about Arendt, of course, is that she depicts us as living in a particularly different world. And let me just pull an image up here for you. She particularly runs us in a different world, and I have it on screen now here. The top image is the world that she imagines that we live in. And this is back in the 1960s. Now, how true is it today, 80 years later? And she wrote The Human Condition in 1958, that's 64 years ago. Okay? We have a giant mass society world, and the realms of privacy are getting, and the realms of politics are getting overeaten by the mass society. Then a huge mass society, right? This is the image. This is not, Arendt never said this image. This is my interpretation of Arendt and her descriptions. But this is the image, this kind of visual image to help bring it up, see what's really going on here. And so your realm of privacy, when you think about how much time you use your phone or your computer where you're engaging with somebody else, right? Your realms of privacy get kind of eroded. Your private life, like how much time alone do you spend with God? How much time are you really doing that's on yourself, in your privacy? And where is your protection actually, right? That's being eroded by mass society. And this is the impact of the social world. Remember, in the polis, when Arendt talks about the polis, you have to remember that the polis, well, you don't really remember it, but you have to think that the polis was a situation where you had a sharp division between private and public. That was the boundary of your home. And in private is the place of self-refinement, and in public is the place that you appear. But we don't have that sharp boundary in just two spots. We have a political world, we have a social world, and we have a private world as well. But the social world constantly eats away at it. It's like a wave of the ocean that kind of hits your soul and just erodes more and more of your soul away. That's what she has in mind. It's a very pessimistic view of the way the world is. And she writes this before the age of social media. She was just talking about normal media at this point, that normal media was doing this. So many people were hanging out in front of the television. People were wanting, that mass society sort of did this. And then there's the corporate influence too. You got to buy this, you got to look this way, you got to do this, right? That kind of pressure on you is consistent and powerful, and it erodes you away. This is Arendt's argument, and what's wrong with the modern life. Right, and it hits us in the private world, but it also hits us politically. This is the interesting thing, is it also hits us politically. We know very much, like just the easiest example is to say that the amount of disinformation that goes out on social media is huge. It's huge, and it affects our politics, and it fixes our voting, and all of that kind of thing. This seems like a kind of, in a sense, a despairing view of the world, a very pessimistic view of the world. I think it was very realistic, though, a realistic description of what's happening. And she did this so many years ago. But instead, what I want to offer, and what I said I think Arendt helps us to offer, is this image. And the lower portion of the screen is this image, where you as an individual and your freedom makes sense. Here, you're not free at all with mass society at the top. But on the bottom here, freedom actually has a kind of structure. So instead of mass society, what you deal with are smaller communities made up of significant others. And the individual emerges out of those significant others into the public world and actually acts in a free way. Now, some of you don't know this young woman Melissa, who was in my other class. We happened to have a nice conversation. I found out more about who she was, and she decided to show it to me. I mean, at different points, each one of you have shown me stuff. She decided to talk about her private life a little bit and show some stuff to me about her private life and what it's about and how much she has to work and how difficult it is to do school at the same time. And she's an international student as well, and so how difficult that process is. And she showed that to me. Now, I don't see her individual refinement in private. I still am not her significant other. I'm just a teacher at her school. But she shows it to me in public. Just like us, we show it to other people. But all of that refinement is happening behind the scenes. And that's the important thing, is that all of that refinement is happening behind the scenes. And who do you do that with? You do not do it with mass society. You do not share your details out with mass society. You only can do that with significant others in terms of the act of refinement, of where you're cared and safe, where you're assured that, right? Where you're assured that development, that individual development. And this is the alternative point, and this is where I think Arendt gets us. And primarily what it is a changing of the way we look at the worldview. Do we look at it? Do we see what we exist in today as something like the top picture? Or can we imagine something like the bottom picture, where our freedom is much more assured because it's sourced in significant others? Right? It's actually like actual freedom. It's not just a faith in God, but it's a faith in God with other people. It's not just who are we meant to be as God's children, but it's well, God is communicating with us through our significant others, right? This is really, really, really important. And if you read the Bible, and especially, of course, I'm going to get another version of, you're going to get another version of 1 John here in a moment here. I have to reshare just because that left. The Bible says a lot about this. Very interestingly, and it feels like obscure language, it seems really simple, but I actually think that there's a mechanics of it. This is actually the mechanics towards a kind of like this balance between individual and society that gets us more in the space where God wants us to be. And so it says in 1 John verse 2, or chapter 2, verses 15 to 17, sorry, it says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. This is from the New International Version, so it's not gender inclusive, but that's okay. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. And so if we look at that image that we had up before, where the community is coming, where you're coming out of a group of significant others, which I labeled the community in the picture, what you see is a person who's ready to do the will of God. That is, you are, in a sense, structurally prepared to do God's will. But if you think of yourself as isolated, you'll be overwhelmed by mass society. And eventually mass society will erode every bit of you. And of me, too. That's the important thing. And so when the author of 1 John writes this, he's articulating this very clearly. The more that we lust after what's in the world is the more we lust after what's presented to us by mass society. And it takes us away. And it leads us to these kinds of things. So that's the last message I want to give. And the last bit of content that I want to give. And hope that that somehow lands at home. Monday, I'll go over part 1 of the exam. Wednesday, I'll go over part 2 of the exam, and I'll send out the preparation notes today before I leave at 4 o'clock. Cheers.
Thank you.